Now.
Hello, PhotoPilllers! Welcome to another masterclass. Today we're gonna learn how to take amazing panos at night, panos including the Milky Way arch, with David Swindler. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Raphael. Excited to join you guys today.
Yeah, we had so much fun in our last week. I think it was expedition in the southwest with 10 photos more, and we learned so much on how to photograph these amazing panoramas of the Milky Way. I couldn't resist asking you to come here and teach us live. And thank you for joining us today. I know that a lot of people is waiting for this class, so thank you.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it. And guys, if you have any questions, just put that into the chat, and then periodically, we can stop and answer some of those questions. I want this to be very informative for all of you, and thank you again for attending live. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Awesome.
And let's do this. Actually, what I might want to do, I'm going to have to do it this way. Okay. All right, let me hide this little guy down below. And so, yeah, as Raphael said, we're going to talk today about creating captivating night panoramas. Shooting a panorama can be technically challenging. And when we add in the complexity of shooting at night, it becomes even a little bit more challenging on top of that. So I want to talk through some of my best known methods for how to shoot and how to plan your shoots. And we'll talk about how PhotoPills can assist us and lots of other things. So a little
Awesome.
bit about me. I grew up in the great state of Iowa, and I noticed in the chat that we have quite a few live attendees here from Iowa. So greetings. I grew up in Cedar Falls. And from a very young age, I was always interested in artistic pursuits. I was really into classical piano. I competed quite a bit, through my younger years up through high school. And this is a picture of me, playing at the Iowa State Fair. And then one thing I did know is that I hated getting my photo taken. And whenever I would see my mom or dad get the camera out, I'd try to run away just so I wouldn't have to get my picture taken. But one time my mom was just too smart for me, and she caught me pouting in front of the mirror with a big frown on my face because I didn't want my picture taken, and she still got it. And so that's one of the reasons why I got into photography later in life, is because if I had the camera in my hand, then I could control what photos were taken. So I ended up studying chemical engineering in college and went to work in the semiconductor industry. And I was a photolithographer, which is a fancy term for saying we print really, really small patterns on silicon wafers. And it's really an advanced analog of photography because, we're using photosensitive chemicals and we're using light to expose onto that photosensitive layer and developing that away. And so, naturally for me, the physics of photography came very easily. But I've always loved the outdoors. Love hiking and exploring and biking, you name it. But I wanted to be able to share these experiences that I have outdoors with other people. And so that's what led me into nature photography. And over the years, I got more and more into it. Well, one summer, I was out backpacking around Mount Rainier. The wildflowers were going gangbusters, and it was just so, so beautiful. But I kept having this nagging thought, and it kept nagging at me. And I kept thinking, do I really want to be in this job for the rest of my career? Granted, I love the people I worked with. I loved the advanced technology we got to use. It was a lot of fun. But wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in that cubicle environment for another 10 years. Well, I decided right then and there that the answer was no, that I did not want to do that for the next 10 years. And so I told myself, I'm going to commit to quitting my job at the next good opportunity. And I thought, you know what? The next good opportunity might be 2 or 3 years away. I've got time to figure this stuff out. Well, the very day I got back to work, they announced a voluntary severance package. And they said, anyone who wants to quit, come and take the package. It's like, well, I asked for a good opportunity. This is it. I've already committed. So I walked into my boss's office that day and took the package, and then had to figure out what I was going to do to make a living. And that's when I decided, after a few months of kind of investigation and figuring things out, I decided to start Action Photo Tours. And the reason I did that is actually threefold. I love getting out into the outdoors. I love nature photography, but even more, I love instructing and educating people. And it's great to take a shot and try to sell that as a print, but I think it's even more gratifying when I help other people take shots that they are proud of and they want to print and hang above their mantle. So Action Photo Tours began in 2014 in Kanab, Utah. And Kanab is an area I call the crossroads of the Southwest. And it's really central to almost all the places I love most about the Southwest. You got Grand Canyon, you got Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon, Grand Staircase Escalante, Lake Powell, Vermilion Cliffs, White Pocket, The Wave. All those things are just all around you. Doesn't matter what direction you go, you're going to find something amazing to point your camera at. And so we offer a large variety of photo tours and multi-day workshops in the desert Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and beyond. And so I invite you to visit our website, actionphototours.com. Give me a follow on Facebook. I love connecting with everyone on Instagram. And it's so much, it's just great having this big photographic community. And you can see this photo here on the right. It's a group that I had up in a place I call the Great Chamber. And this is a location that I actually ended up naming. I was one of the first people to ever post a night shot from this location. I called it the Great Chamber. This is years ago, and it's now caught on, and that's what everybody calls it. So kind of cool. So as you can see here, Kanab, Utah really is central to so many things all throughout the Southwest. Fabulous place to visit. If you come once, you're going to want to come back again and again because the concentration of cool sites is just staggering. Another thing I'm involved with is the Outsiders. And we're a group of Utah-based photographers, and we put on educational conferences every year. And we just finished up last month our conference in Kanab and had around 300 people attending live. It was a fantastic event. We had Paul Nicklin and Christina Mittermeier there as keynotes and had so many other wonderful speakers and educators, along with a whole host of industry sponsors.
Yeah,
so we'll be
and you got me.
yes, and Raphael was there too. Absolutely. Yeah, it was a great event to really connect with people. Then you can go out and capture amazing photos of the Southwest. And then another one of our pillars is for conserving the natural environment. Super important, especially in this day and age. So we'll be announcing soon our conference for next year, which will also be in March of 2023. Stay tuned. So my mission, he says, is I got into photography because I wanted to share the inspiration of the natural world with others. And so because of that, I strongly believe in portraying real places under actual conditions that can be seen and appreciated by anyone who goes there at the right times. And so in other words, that means I don't do things like compositing, or taking a sky from one place and putting it in a shot I took somewhere else. I like to, for me, the challenge of photography is going out there and trying to get those conditions, right then and there. And that might mean having to go back again and again and again to really get that stunning shot. But at the same time, as a workshop leader and instructor, I think it is imperative that I portray real landscapes that, someone's not going to be disappointed when they show up there in person and be like, this looks like nothing what your shot looked like. And so, because of that, I embrace techniques that help compensate for the limitations of digital cameras. So I'll do things in post-processing like stacking sky shots for noise reduction, shooting foregrounds at lower ISO, using low-level lighting to illuminate foregrounds, stitching panoramas, focus stacking when depth of field limited, etc. So the outline of my talk today is I'm going to talk about why do you want to shoot panos. Next, we'll go over some of my essential pano shooting techniques. Then we'll go over planning your shoot. And then we'll talk about foreground enhancement techniques. And then we'll go over some tracking and stacking and end with some gear and software suggestions. Now, just as a side note, this presentation will only focus on single row panoramas. I am not intending to cover multi-row panos and gigapixel images. So what is a panorama? By definition, it's any wide angle field of view or representation of physical space. And panoramic photography began as the merging of multiple images way back in the mid 1800s. But of course, digital processing now makes it much easier. And we'll be discussing the advantages behind merging multiple images. And just as another side note, this is not about cropping a single image to panoramic proportions. And shooting a pano can be single row or it can be multi-row stitch, like a gigapixel type approach. So why do you want to shoot panos? Well, first of all, you're going to get a lot more megapixels for large and detailed prints. You know, my cameras, they can shoot anywhere from like 42 megapixels up to 61 megapixels in a single shot, which is quite a few megapixels. But if I go and shoot a panorama with that same camera, now I can have anywhere from 100 to 200 plus megapixels to work with. And then I can easily do like a 60-inch, a 96-inch print, whatever I need to really get that stunning quality. The resulting aspect ratio can work better for interior design and wall art compared to your standard or native 3:2 aspect ratio. And then you can photograph the full arc of the Milky Way during the right times of the year. And you can capture a much larger swath of sky and landscape with your shots. And then this is an advantage I love about panos, is I can shoot with a slightly longer focal length with less of that dreaded wide angle flattening. And then it's fun. It's going to challenge you both creatively and technically. So here's an example from Mount Rainier. You can see I've got the Milky Way over on the side. You got some light pollution clear over on the right edge. I got Jupiter right over the peak. And then the snow, of course, really helps reflect a lot of light back to bring the landscape to life. It's a good shot. There's nothing bad about it. But at the same time, I think, when you can capture a wider field of view, especially with the right composition, that the shots can often tell a better story. And so this is from that same location where I was standing just a little bit earlier in the evening. And now you can see the broader landscape and the full arc of the Milky Way. And, being able to find compositional elements that help lead the eye through the scene is so important. We have that little bit of light hitting the foreground snow. I've got the tent, I've got the sub-peak in the middle, and then leading all the way over to the Milky Way core right over Mount Rainier. And this was done as a stacked or a stitched panorama of multiple shots. So let's discuss a little bit about night panorama subjects. Of course, we have the obvious that we've already shown, the Milky Way and the galactic core. But guess what? There is so much more. When I go up north to the Arctic, I love the Aurora Borealis. And if you're down south, you've got the Aurora Australis. We've got moonscapes. We've got cityscapes. And you don't have to shoot horizontal panels either. You can always shoot a vertorama, where you, instead of moving the camera left to right, you'd move it up and down, and much, much more. So let's go over the stitched panorama method. And so the first thing you're going to do is shoot a series of side-by-side shots with sufficient overlap. And I get asked this a lot. How much overlap do I need to have? Well, if we're using normal lenses, then you need at least 30% overlap. By normal lenses, that means anything with a mid-range focal length up to telephoto focal lengths. And so that can be like 40 millimeters plus is probably a good guesstimate on that normal range. Now for the wide angle lenses, then you're going to start needing more overlap. You're going to need like that 50% overlap. And the wider the lens, the more overlap you're going to need. If I'm going to try to shoot a pano with something like a a 12 millimeter lens, then I'm probably going to be using something like maybe 70+% overlap. And then you want to ensure each frame is level with the horizon and with the same degree of forward or backward tilt. In other words, how much the camera is leaning forward or tilting backwards. But every frame definitely needs to be level with that horizon. And then you want to keep the shot settings consistent for each frame. That includes exposure settings and also your color settings. In other words, your white balance. Especially if the light changes quite a bit, from one side of the pano to the other. If you're using something like your auto white balance or something, it's going to change so much. Now you're going to have very inconsistent coloration across your frame. And then you want to focus once, and you don't want to change the focus. And then my final tip here is shoot one extra frame on both the left side and the right side so that you can have ample crop margin. So as far as focal lengths go, as you probably know from your past experience, wide angle focal lengths will flatten the perspective and they increase the distance between foreground and background. So if you have these nice jagged mountain peaks in your background and you shoot them with a wide angle lens, well, they're going to look very short and stubby. They're not going to look tall and jagged. The telephoto focal lengths, on the other hand, they augment the perspective and will compress the distance between your foreground and the background. So a single shot with that wide angle focal length will often cause that flattening effect. But if you shoot a stitched pano with a longer focal length, that will solve the problem and produce that more true to life perspective while still being able to have that really wide field of view. So this is an example here of a telephoto pano, 200 millimeter, 3 horizontal shots. And you can see that it compresses that tree nicely into those hills back behind it. And, if I had shot this, if I had gone up a little closer and shot it with a less of a telephoto focal length, then it wouldn't appear like that tree was as close to those hills. So that's one thing I like about these longer focal lengths is it has this compression type effect, especially for landscapes. Here's a shot I took. It's a 5 vertical shots. And when I first got up on this ridge line, I thought, oh, I can shoot this at like 16 millimeter. Well, when I put 16 millimeter lens on, it didn't look right. The mountain looked really short and the moon looked like this tiny little dot in the sky. I wanted better than that. So I went to 30 millimeter. I put my camera in vertical mode, and then I took 5 shots across the frame to be able to enhance the perspective of the mountain to make it look more like what I was really seeing. And it also helped the moon not to be so small in my frame. And this was a really neat atmospheric effect that I experienced that evening. Those rays that you see in the sky, those are what we call anti-crepuscular rays that occur opposite the direction of the light source. And that happened just as the moon was setting back behind the mountain. So now we move on to, do we want to shoot the pano in horizontal mode? Or do we want to shoot the pano in vertical mode? Well, with horizontal, it requires fewer shots. You're going to have a little smaller file size and faster processing. No L bracket may be required, although I do recommend everybody get an L bracket for your camera because it just makes life so much easier. And then it's best for situations with movement, fast changing light, or if you're doing very long exposures and you're impatient like I am. Now, vertical mode, you're going to take more shots, and it can also be more time consuming, especially if you're shooting at night. You're going to get much larger file sizes, so if you're trying to get the largest possible file size, that may be a good thing. But in other times, it's not so good because, a 200 megapixel image on the computer takes a lot more time to process. You can also shoot longer focal lengths and include more sky and landscape with the vertical mode. And it may be prone to more stitching issues because now you have more frames that have to fit together. And so you just have to be careful, if you have fast moving clouds or something, maybe vertical isn't the best technique to use because there will be so much movement error from left to right side that, hey, it may not stitch for you. And so you mentioned, you may remember I recommended that you shoot one extra frame on the left and the right side for crop margin. The reason why we want to do that is because these wide angle lenses, they are prone to barrel distortion. And that means we're going to lose image areas, especially up around the corners. And because of that, the wider the lens is, the more overlap I recommend. So that way you're getting out of that barrel distortion regime and using the better central parts of that lens that are going to show less of that distortion. And so for best results, we want to shoot all shots of that panel level to the horizon. So if you look at the little electronic leveler there at the bottom, that's the best way, or one of the easiest ways, especially when you're shooting at night, to tell if your camera's level. And I can tell you from past experience that when it's dark outside, you can be so off from level and not even realize it until you get back home. So definitely use that electronic leveler. It's easy to see in the dark. And you want that line to be green. Now, depending on your camera model, every camera is going to show the degree of tilt a little bit differently. And the degree of tilt, like on the Sony display that you see on the left side, if it's perfectly neutral, then it's going to be that wide line in the middle, like you see where the line is green. If you have a non-neutral tilt, it's going to be more like the shot you see there in the middle, where you can see we're 2 notches below neutral tilt. Unlike Nikon's, which is on the right side, then it's going to start showing you this little yellow trapezoid. And that shows you the degree of non-neutral tilt. And so neutral tilt is obviously the easiest to stitch. If you use a non-neutral tilt, you just want to make sure it is consistent on every shot. And if you use really extreme tilt angles, just know that there's a high likelihood that it may not stitch. So just be careful on how crazy you go with some of that. And of course, the more extreme tilt angle you use, the more overlap you're going to need. So moving subjects. Subjects with consistent, slow, or repeatable movement can often stitch fine. Things like the night sky, slow water flow, or aurora borealis. But this is important. You need to complete that left to right sweep of your pano as quickly as possible in order to get the best results. And I recommend in those cases that you do a horizontal pano versus mounting the camera vertically. Because of course with a horizontal pano, you don't have to take as many shots. And you're not going to be as prone to stitching artifacts. And it's good to take multiple passes if you have a moving subject, just in case the first one you do doesn't work. And subjects with fast, dynamic, or non-linear movement will probably not stitch well. And if you do try to take a panel like that, it's probably going to require some sort of reconstructive surgery or additional blending in Photoshop. So here's an example of some fog moving through the valley down below. This was taken at blue hour. And this is up above a ski resort. And the ski resort had night skiing going on at the time, and they had all their lights on, which is why you see the fog being lit up from underneath. And so I took a series of these longer exposures at blue hour. I did it as a horizontal pano. And even though this stuff was moving, it was moving slow enough that it stitched together just fine. Here's an example that's not at night, but it's inside of a snow cave. And we have movement going on here. We have all these drips coming off the ceiling. We have this water rushing through the bottom. But because the water flow here is so laminar and consistent, along with the drips, I was able to shoot a panoramic stitch, and everything is able to merge together just fine. But if I have a situation, like I said, with nonlinear movement or dynamic or very fast moving action, it's probably not going to work. So a few gotchas here. You want to turn off the image stabilizer or vibration reduction, both in your lens and in the camera body, if you are shooting on a tripod. And I definitely recommend that you do shoot on a tripod for better control. That doesn't mean you can't shoot handheld. I've shot handheld panels many times during the daytime, but as the light gets lower, definitely get it on the tripod. And then don't bump the focus or zoom rings when you're taking the pano. And you want to tighten your ball head for every shot. So often I see people rotate the camera and then they just take the shot without really tightening it down. Again, you can get small movements in your setup if you're not going through the rigor of tightening down your gear. And then you want to check each frame for sharpness by zooming in and observing the detail at 100%. Just one soft or blurry frame can ruin the entire shoot. And I've had this happen to me before, when it's like a little bit windy or something like that. I might take a 5-shot pano, think I'm good. I get home on the computer and realize that the middle shot was blurry. Well, now I can't use it. It has to go in the trash. So I'd rather check it, when I'm in the field and can make course corrections. Oh crap, yeah, this image is blurry. I better retake this and check it again. And then don't put important elements too close to the top or bottom of the frame. And this is because they're going to either get cropped or they're going to get stretched out and look really weird. And I would include the Milky Way in that as well. If the Milky Way gets too close to the top of the frame, you're going to get these weird, like elongated, horizontal looking stars at the top of your frame that are going to look kind of weird. And then look for for any moving elements that may interfere with your stitching, like fast moving clouds, like a tree branch blowing in the wind, etc. And then, especially at night and also during the daytime, when you have sunlight and stuff coming in, you want to watch for flare if there are nearby light sources. Some of these lenses we like to shoot with, they can just pick up so much flare if you're shooting at just the wrong angle. And so if you do get an area that gets a lot of flare coming in, that's another thing that can ruin your entire pano. And then you want to shoot that pano sequence as quickly as possible to avoid bad stitching. So now let's move on to our shot settings for nighttime photography.
David,
yes,
we have a few questions. Do you mind answering them before moving on?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Awesome. David Lynch is asking, are you worried that using your high megapixels camera, 40 61 megapixels, force you into lower length of exposure shots?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I don't like shooting my super high resolution camera at night, so I'll definitely choose a lower resolution camera for doing my night shots. Yep.
Cool. Jerry C, are the shots taken without the pano head?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to show you a little all-purpose head that I really like to use. It's not a dedicated pano head, but it works for all types of shooting. And it makes the job go a lot easier.
And the last one, 34 media. Do you recommend noise reduction when stitching panos to decrease time between?
It really depends on what I'm shooting, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we proceed on in the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Raphael. So yeah, at night, we want to use manual mode on the camera and a manual white balance. And that's because, the camera doesn't know how to white balance at night. It's pitch dark out. And we also have to use manual mode because it's not going to be able to gauge a proper exposure through metering. And then we have to use manual focus. And we don't want to move the zoom or the focus rings after our focus is acquired. And then you want to keep your settings consistent from left to right as long as the ambient light conditions remain constant. So, if I'm shooting after astronomical twilight, well, guess what? The light conditions remain consistent. So I definitely want to keep the same exposure settings. But if the ambient light is changing and we're doing long exposures, like for example, during the deep blue hour, then you may need to make small adjustments to the exposure time and or your white balance to keep things consistent. And so one trick I will often use when I'm shooting in blue hour is then that is one of the few times I'll actually use auto white balance, because it'll help kind of balance the colors, from left to right as I go across as the light levels are continually changing. And then I will also either increase or decrease my exposure time from shot to shot, just depending on how fast that light is going away, just to make sure I'm trying to keep that exposure as consistent as possible. So deep blue hour shooting can often be one of the most challenging times to pull off a successful pano. But now the next section I want to move into is how we plan our shot. When is the Milky Way going to be in the right position? When is it going to be low enough to actually be useful as a pano? And then when we get there, how do we get things set up? How do we figure out how to shoot this thing? So a few planning guidelines. First of all, you must identify a clear subject. So over here, I had a clear subject. I had this hoodoo, I was going to be able to get right in the middle, and I was going to get hoodoos on either side to kind of help balance out the shot. Next, we don't want to include too much information in a panel. Sometimes we just take stuff and it's just way too cluttered. And so you really have to think about that sometimes if there's a way we can simplify it, that less can often be more. And then use your phone camera along with PhotoPills to help identify potential pano opportunities. The phone makes it so easy just to go out there, go left to right, see what it actually looks like, be like, okay, that sucks, or, ooh, this is a really good opportunity. I want to come back with my big camera and shoot this. And then you want to arrive on the scene early and take some test shots and experiment with some different focal lengths. And for night shots, it may help to pre-visualize your concept by shooting during the day. So planning for Milky Way panos, first of all, we have to determine, are you going to be in the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere? And obviously I'm talking to an international audience here. For the Northern Hemisphere, assuming mid-latitudes, late February is when we can start seeing the Milky Way again in panoramic fashion. And that's going to happen just before astronomical twilight begins in the wee hours of the morning. And we can shoot these panos up until about mid-June, just after astronomical twilight ends, early in the evening. And in the Northern Hemisphere, the arc will be to the east, spanning north to south, with the galactic core of the Milky Way towards the south. Now for the Southern Hemisphere, again, assuming mid-latitudes, late May, just before astronomical twilight begins, is when you can start shooting those panos. And you can be able to do that up until about October, just after astronomical twilight ends. And the arc of the Milky Way is going to be to the west, and again, spanning north to south. So this is what the Milky Way looks like, in our Northern Hemisphere. The galactic core is going to be kind of on the right side of the images. And it's going to be a lot lower to the horizon. As you go into the Southern Hemisphere, now the Milky Way arcs a lot higher in the sky, and the galactic core of the Milky Way can also get much higher in the sky. And there's also a lot of cool features, in that Southern Hemisphere night sky. Like if you look at the tip of that tree branch, you can see that funky looking cloud thing. Well, that's the Large Magellanic Cloud, one of my favorite features of the southern sky. Right there. Mm-hmm. And so as far as pano planning, you want to look at what is your max Milky Way elevation angle. And so I'm going to give you an example from Kanab, Utah in the month of May. And so when the galactic core visibility begins, which is on a perfectly flat horizon, the max Milky Way elevation is 11.6 degrees. And again, where did I get these numbers? From PhotoPills, of course. And so when the galactic core is now 3.5 degrees above the horizon, now the max Milky Way angle is about 15 degrees. And that's great for just a horizontal image. In fact, you can probably take a single shot and almost get the whole Milky Way when it's that low. But you would have to have a fairly flat horizon for that to work. The sweet spot is kind of that 20 to 25 degrees. The galactic center at that point is 7.6 to about 11 degrees above the horizon. And the Milky Way is going to have a nice arc to it, but without getting too extreme and exaggerated. And at 30 degrees, the galactic center is now 14 degrees above the horizon. The Milky Way is going to have a very definitive arch to it, and it's going to require much wider lenses to shoot it. And then the cutoff is when it starts getting 35 degrees or greater. Now it's just getting just way too high in the sky to be able to successfully pull off any type of single row pano. And so if we go and look at the 2D modeling in PhotoPills, so these circles basically represent 10-degree increments from 0 up to 90 degrees. And so that outermost circle, of course, is 0 degrees. Then you see another white line that's very close to that outer circle. That's the 10-degree mark. Then 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, and so on and so forth. That big white dot is where the galactic center of the Milky Way resides. And the other white dots represent the remaining part of the Milky Way. And so this is a good way to kind of help visualize, how high is the Milky Way getting by degrees from the angle that, I'm going to be standing and the time of night I am going to be shooting. And then if we look here, when on the left side, this is when the Milky Way is just rising. And you can see the galactic center, it's only 0.5 degrees above the horizon. And the max Milky Way elevation is also going to be given. And that's at 12 degrees. So it's very, very low. If we wait a little bit later in the night, and wait till like 1 o'clock in the morning, now our galactic center is 11 degrees above the horizon. And our max Milky Way elevation that you can see in that upper bar of the PhotoPills, that is now saying 25.9 degrees. That is kind of that optimal range to be able to pull off most of these night panoramics. And so this is an example of what the ideal Milky Way height would look like. And then this is an example where it's starting to get too high. And this is with a max Milky Way angle of 38 degrees. So these are both the same location. This is when it's about 25 degrees. This is when it's like up to like 38 degrees, very high. And in order to even shoot this when it was up to 38 degrees, I couldn't even do it as a single row. I had to do it vertically at 15 millimeters. And I had to point my camera way up to get the sky like that. Then I had to point my camera down at neutral tilt, do a longer exposure, 4 minutes apiece, and then I could put both of those together.
No.
All right, so Raphael, any questions at this point?
Yeah, we have just one question on by Jim Carlin, asking if during blue hour should you use aperture priority?
It depends on how deep the blue hour is. If it's just mild blue hour, yeah, the camera can meter just fine, and you can use aperture priority to kind of keep a consistent exposure. But as you get deeper into blue hour, the camera is going to struggle to meter correctly. And you'll be able to tell, because it'll start blinking at you and start saying, I can't figure out what the exposure is going to be. And then at that point, you want to switch over to manual mode and then start dialing in your exposures according to how much light you have.
Cool. We have two more, actually, questions.
Okay.
Chris Casual, how do you plan your distance to foreground subject for a Milky Way arch?
I would say the best way is just to go there and check it out in person. Because you can use the night AR in PhotoPills to kind of see how it's going to look relative to your subject. And then you can pinpoint your spot and be able to come back there. Because, there's a lot of things that you can't really gauge from just a map and planning from a phone or a desktop computer. And so there's no substitute to just boots on the ground, getting out there, checking it out ahead of time before you actually go to shoot it.
Cool, thank you. That's a very good. AR, night AR is key.
Yes,
in the field.
Yes, it's very key. So once you're on location, you want to arrive during those daylight hours to check things out ahead of time, and then shoot some test panels to see what works best. And then you got to decide, well, what focal length will I use? Do I want to walk closer to my subject? Do I want to walk a little further away? Will horizontal or vertical shots work better for you? And then how far from left to right do you need to cover? And then will you use a neutral forward or backward tilt? And then are there any concerns with close foreground elements, with things that would cause problems with things like parallax error, or would there be need for like focus stacking? And I can tell you from experience that trying to combine focus stacking with pano stitching is not a good idea. So you're far better off trying to find compositions and angles that are not going to require any type of focus stacking. And so the more of this that you can get worked out in the daytime hours before you're out there when it's pitch dark, it's going to make your job so much easier. So now, what about foregrounds? Well, shooting a night sky is relatively straightforward, but combining a night sky with a well-exposed foreground is much more difficult. And so I want to discuss the 3 levels of night photography, along with various methods of foreground enhancement. And the 3 levels of night photography, this is a technique that I coined to help make it more, the concepts easier to grasp for my students. And so in level 1, we do as a single shot. There's no Photoshop required. I know a lot of students that come in, they're like, ooh, I hate Photoshop. I don't ever want to use it. Then these are the kind of people I steer towards level 1 night photography. Your foreground, though, is going to be dark or silhouetted if you're using only natural light. But if you're using the low-level lighting technique, then your foreground will be nicely illuminated. But the downsides to level 1 is that you're going to expect a lot of noise and grain in both the sky and the landscape. And also the detail in the landscape is going to be lacking due to the high ISO that we're shooting at. With level 2 now, it gets more complicated. Now we have to do Photoshop, and because we're going to do 2 shots. One for the sky at high ISO to capture those stars, and a second for the landscape at lower ISO, albeit much longer time. And then Photoshop is required to select the sky from one shot and merge it with the landscape from the other. The benefit here is that the landscape is going to have much better detail retention due to lower ISO. However, the sky will still need some luminance noise reduction in post-production. Moving on to level 3, which is going to be the most work, but also the highest quality. Instead of shooting a single shot for the sky now, we're going to do the sky as a stack of several high ISO shots, or from a longer exposure by using a tracking device. The foreground is shot at lower ISO for detail retention and blended, just like in level 2, using Photoshop. The stacked shots that you do, they're going to have to be combined using special software. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then if you do this technique, both the sky and the landscape will be very clean with little noise or grain. Now, I often get asked by people, well, why in level 3, why wouldn't you just also stack for the foreground in the landscape? Wouldn't that help it? Well, the reason why I don't do that is because if I take a high ISO shot and look at the level of detail retention that the sensor is able to pull out, it looks very mushy. It doesn't look good. And it doesn't matter how many shots I take at that high ISO and try to average together, that mushy detail is going to persist. In other words, garbage in always equals garbage out. And so the only way to get higher quality detail is to shoot at an ISO where the sensor is capable of producing that detail. And that's why I shoot at lower ISO for all of my foregrounds. And I will only do the stacking for my night sky where I have movement going on with the stars. So moving on to foreground enhancement techniques. And so the first technique you can do is you can just shoot right in the middle of the night a slightly lower ISO, and with a really, really long exposure time. And if you're only using the light of the stars to light up your landscape, it can take a long time to really properly expose it. And so in order to figure out what that time needs to be, that's when I'll whip out the PhotoPills and go to the exposure pill, and I'll put in something like ISO 50,000 or 25,000 or something like that. And I'll take a test shot. And let's say I take a 10-second test shot at ISO 50,000. Well, then I can use that exposure pill to figure out what the proper exposure would actually be at a more reasonable ISO, let's say ISO 1600. Another way to do it is we can shoot at blue hour. The nice thing about blue hour is that we get to use lower ISO because there is more light available. That means better quality. I can also get more directional light for better depth and dimension. If I'm shooting in the middle of the night with only starlight to light up the landscape, well, that light source is basically omnidirectional. It's coming from all angles all at once. That means that any light that falls on that landscape is going to be very flat light. It's not going to show the depth or three-dimensionality of the landscape. However, if I shoot at the blue hour, that's when I get the much more directional light because I still have some light from the eastern or western horizon, kind of adding that depth to my land. The third way is to use low-level lighting, where we will set up our own LED light panels on stationary, like tripods or light stands, and be able to light up what's in front of us. Now, of course, low-level lighting, it looks beautiful if you have the right kind of foreground. But it has to be a foreground that's relatively close, because obviously you can't light up a huge canyon with an LED light panel. Or the final way is you can just wait for the moon, if you're on the right type of night, wait for that moon to come up and illuminate your landscape. And again, PhotoPills is a wonderful tool if you want to try to find opportunities for when things like that will occur. So here's an example of a level 1 shot. This is a combination of 5 vertical images. And the reason I did it as level 1 is because it's all silhouetted. I don't need to see high amounts of detail with just a silhouette. Mine will keep it simple. Here's an example of a level 2. And so with the level 2, I exposed my foreground at a longer time and lower ISO to be able to bring out better detail. And then I shot the sky as a single pass. And the reason why I decided to do that instead of trying to do like stacking and tracking and all those fancier things is because I had foliage sticking up into the sky. And that produces little pieces of sky that basically aren't going to average out nicely. And if I was using a tracking device, those would be blurred out too much to be able to use. And so whenever I have like little snippets of sky that are being like obstructed, by a complicated foreground or basically land to sky interface, then I will automatically elect just to use level 2 because I know I'm going to get so many artifacts if I try to stack or track in those particular areas. But if I don't have anything like that to worry about and I have a relatively straightforward landscape to sky interface, then yeah, I can do panoramic images where I also do stacking. And so in this case, I stacked each individual frame of this pano and then combined the stack shots together to produce the sky. And now it's a very clean shot, devoid of most of that high ISO noise and grunge. So as far as the foreground shooting goes for night panels, I will take separate panoramic shots for the landscape and the night sky. The one you're going to shoot first is just going to depend on the time of day, the position of the stars, and the desired foreground enhancement technique you want to use. And so when I shoot a pano for the night sky, the first thing I do is I do a single pass first as a safety shot. And in that case, I am going to turn on my camera's long exposure noise reduction. And that goes back to one of those earlier questions. Because I'm just doing this as a single pass left to right, that inclusion of extra long exposure noise reduction time is going to only have minimal effect. And it will certainly help with any hot pixels I have, especially if the ambient temperature is warm. And then I will go back and do a second pass, starting from left to right. And this time I'll do 6 to 10 back-to-back images that I can then use for stacking. And I'm going to do that with no long exposure noise reduction. And the reason why I do that is because I want to minimize the amount of time it takes me to shoot from left to right, and because stacking will automatically take care of any of that hot pixel noise. Then I go back and shoot a panel for the landscape. So unless you're aiming for that basic level 1 approach, the landscape shots are going to have to be done with longer exposures and lower ISOs than the sky shots. And whenever I do these longer exposures for the landscape, I definitely have to use long exposure noise reduction. So if I shoot a 4-minute shot, then it's going to have to be followed by a 4-minute long exposure noise reduction. Then I move the camera, take another 4-minute shot, followed by another 4 minutes of long exposure noise reduction. If you skip that step, you can end up with so many hot pixels that it can absolutely destroy the photo. And if you try to remove some of those hot pixels in post, it can be so destructive to your smaller details that it's not going to look very good. So I highly suggest just using the in-camera approach, using the LENR, because it's far simpler than trying to take your own dark frames and doing all that other stuff afterwards, which ends up taking just as much time in the field. And then for level 3, you're going to stack each frame of the sky pano first. And then you're going to stitch the sky and landscape panels using the software of your choice. And then you're going to roughly align the 2 panels. In Photoshop, you're going to make a selection of the horizon line from the landscape panel. And then you combine the sky panel in Photoshop. And this is the important tip here, is that you position the horizon line from the sky panel slightly below the landscape horizon. And no matter how you set things up, there's always going to be some slight misalignments between the landscape shot and the sky shot that you produce. There's going to be differences in how the software chooses to merge and stitch those images together. There's going to be slight movements in how your tripod was, or how your ball head was, or whatever it is that you're using. So here's an example from Lake Powell. I first took the panel for the stars, and I took this as a horizontal so I can get done with it much faster. And that was 13 seconds, and I used an ISO of 10,000, which I'm comfortable with on my Sony full frame cameras. And then I went back once the stars were out of position, and I took a panel for the landscape. And this was a 5-minute shot at ISO 1600 with attendant LENR. And so just shooting time alone, this took well over 30 minutes just to complete that bottom row. So you do have to have a modicum of patience, if you are shooting at night and trying to do these really long type exposures. And so then that's my combined landscape panel with the long exposure and everything else going on. And so then I put it into Photoshop and I make a selection based on the landscape to sky interface. And then I bring in the star shot, and you can see here, I just have to move that horizon line from the star shot just slightly below where I place the selection for the landscape shot. And if I do that, then I'm not going to have any of this dark silhouetted landscape accidentally sticking up where it shouldn't be. And then that's the combined result that you can get.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Raphael, any questions up to this point?
Yeah, we have many, actually. Okay. Barry Lidwin, are you on a gimbal, or do you take the nodal point into consideration?
I'm actually going to answer that coming up shortly,
Later.
So stay tuned.
Okay. Awesome. Then we have another question on filters used. So probably you don't use filters.
No, I don't use filters. If I'm shooting during the day, I will generally take off a polarizer because it produces weird gradients when you do panos.
Fabio Mincarelli, this last example you showed, but I think is an example you showed a long time ago, with shots for the sky with the camera elevated. How did you compensate the angle to avoid the gaps in the corners?
So to avoid the gaps in the corners, you just have to shoot one extra frame on the left and the right.
Oh,
and
cool.
then you won't have to crop out anything that you don't want to.
Awesome. They have Erin O'Neill. Can you use Lightroom for level 2?
You cannot. You must use Photoshop to be able to combine those.
Steve 914. When you say lower ISO for the background, what do you recommend?
I recommend at least 2 to 3 stops below your sky ISO for best results.
Cool. Cliff Masterson. What kind of histogram do you aim for when shooting sky and foreground? Mid-range or to the right?
I try to have data pushing at least to the midpoint of the histogram.
Cool. Robert Pierenfeldner. How about bias frames? Is that necessary?
Bias?
Bias, or I don't know what it means. Oh, anyway.
Okay.
Len Philpott. When shooting a stacked sky with a tracker, do you also shoot flat frames, dark frames, and bias frames? Or do you just shoot live frames only?
I just use the in-camera LENR. I like to keep things simple. And I find that works better because then you're capturing the sensor heating closer to when the actual shot was taken, and it's going to be most representative.
Awesome. Now a question from Alan Hudina. Alan was in our expedition to the Southwest. So,
hey, Alan.
Hey, Alan. Thanks for watching. Alan asks, how do you ever use the blend if mode in Photoshop to merge your foreground and Milky Way? Any pros or cons?
I do not. I find it's better to do an accurate sky to landscape selection line. A lot of these automated tools, like if you do the select sky in Photoshop, it has just too much feathering that goes on, and I often don't get a very good result. I'd rather have exact control over where that landscape transition falls. And then I'll work on blending the far horizon line using adjustment layers in Photoshop.
Thank you. Now we have Thomas Johansson. Do you use software like Sequator? I suppose you'll be covering this later.
Yeah, so Sequator is the good program to use for Windows PCs for stacking. And for Macs, you want to use a Starry Landscape Stacker.
Nice. James Laskin, assuming that when south of the equator, one needs to shoot right to left.
It really doesn't matter as long as your methodology is consistent. I like to always shoot left to right because it's easier for me to identify how the shots go together when I'm looking at them in post.
Okay, and then we have Ron Santini. Once focused, do you normally tape your lens to prevent accidental movement?
I don't, because so often, I'm going to be taking another series of shots at a different focal length or something like that. I'm just really careful not to bump anything on the camera when I'm moving things around. And I always recheck the focus.
Awesome. And the last one before we continue, Patrick Campbell. Have you tried using the XOPR for noise reduction on high ISO frames?
I have not.
Okay. Perfecto.
All right. Thanks, Rafael.
Thank you.
All right. So another way we can do it is to shoot the foreground at blue hour. So here is a 15 millimeter shot, neutral tilt going across. And then, as the clouds started to clear away, I went back out and shot the Milky Way. And this was like the very last I could shoot it before it got too high in the sky because we were waiting for all these clouds that you can see here to get out of the way. And so, I shot that. I think I shot those at 10 seconds or so. And this is just kind of guidelines for, how I shoot a lot of the night sky stuff. And then you can put those together as a nice blended result. As far as low level lighting go, low level lighting is best when the Milky Way is low to the horizon with the shortest horizontal span. And it can be difficult to keep the lighting consistent from left to right. So you're probably going to have multiple lights. And you may need to place the lights further back and really crank up the power to get them to look more even. And you want to experiment with and position them where you can keep the light out of the panel sweep and also avoid distracting shadows. And if your span of the shoot that you're trying to do is just too wide, it may not even be possible to keep your shadows out and keep the light source out of the frame. And you want to definitely use your lens hood in this case because we can't have flare coming into those wide angle lenses, especially when you're shooting towards the light source. And if nothing else works, just include the light in the frame, or you can just shoot another pass with the light turned off. So this is an example, where I decided just to leave the light in the frame. I ended up thinking it looked kind of cool. And, if I really didn't like it, I could have ran back out there, turned it off, and then taken another shot with it off and been able to mask it out of the panoramic. Here's an example of 6 vertical frames, and I did 6 shots stacked per frame. And then this is when I put everything all together. So, this is the landscape shot here. Then this is with everything together. I did my foreground, ISO 800, 120-second exposures. And I was able to keep the light out of the frame and able to keep it in a small enough field of view that, I was able to avoid the super distracting shadows. So this is a fun shoot. Raphael's actually heading out to Namibia here soon. We were out in Namibia and we're out in the middle of this desert. There's this old abandoned train station out there. Kind of an eerie place to be, actually. And we hadn't seen any traffic come along for the whole time we were out there. And all of a sudden the semi truck comes along and he stops. And we're like, oh no, what's going on here? And the guy gets out of his truck and comes over and he's like, hey, are you guys all right over here? I'm like, oh yeah, we're fine. Thanks for asking. All right, well, be safe. And he takes off. So kind of a fun little story. But you can see here that, this landscape pano, it required 2 passes. And so obviously I'm getting my light source in the shot, but I couldn't get the light shining on this train station in the way I wanted it any other way. And so then I realized, okay, I'm going to have to do this as 2 passes. I'm going to have to do the second one with the light turned off. And then you can see over here, I'm going to have to crop off that right side because now I'm starting to see my own shadow coming into the frame. And so then I did another pass, where I turned that light off and I was able to mask it out. And now I was able to get the effect I was after. So what do you do when you have complicated sky and land interfaces? Well, when it's a real complicated interface, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to stack, and tracking, of course, would be equally difficult. And small holes of sky around rocks, bushes, and trees are not usually going to stack or track well. When this happens, I elect to either shoot level 2, or I find a nearby spot with a clean sky and land interface. So this is a very good example of that problem. So I took my landscape pano at blue hour, when I have the nice directional light coming in. But you can see all those little holes inside the rock, lots of holes near the sky landscape interface. That would be extremely difficult to be able to stack or track without lots of weird artifacts creeping in. Well, what did I do here? Well, what I did is I moved a few feet over to the other side where I had a clean horizon line. And then I shot my sky pano right there. And this was same direction, same everything. And I was able to do stack shots and all that and combine it. And then I could put those together after I made my detailed sky selection. So as far as stacking goes, again, 6 to 10 frames for stacking in a pano stitch. And when I've tried to be greedy and done more than that, I've had it where it doesn't stitch. You want to turn off LANR and you want to shoot back to back. You want to complete the panel from left to right in as little time as possible. And you're going to adjust the number of stacked images based on what focal length you're using, whether you're doing horizontal or vertical frames, the individual length of your exposure. If you're doing like a 20-second exposure versus somebody who's doing a 10-second exposure, well, you probably can only do half as many frames for stacking. And then, of course, you got to look at the proximity of the Milky Way to the top of the frame. And then you're going to stack each frame individually and stitch them together to a panel. And as I mentioned, stacking is entirely optional. You have so much detail when you do a night sky pano that even level 2 is going to look beautiful even after noise reduction in post-production. So trackers versus stacking. You know, trackers are going to add capital expense. They're more weight to carry into the field, and they take time to get aligned. And another gotcha that I want to throw out there is that tracked pano shots may not stitch well if the horizon doesn't line up. Because as you know, the tracker is moving the camera opposite the rotation of the Earth. And so with each shot that you shoot, now the horizon line doesn't quite line up anymore. And so if that is too extreme, the software isn't going to know how to stitch that together. And LENR is required for doing those tracked long exposures if you want to kind of get rid of those hot pixels, unless you're doing your own like dark frames and whatever. Stacking, though, it doesn't add much more time while you're in the field. And even if you aren't stacking, it's a good idea to take multiple sky shots because you never know when you're going to get a nice meteor going through or something. And you can turn off the LENR for those stacked shots. Photoshop is required to blend both stacked and tracked images with the landscape. The nice thing about stacked shots is they line up perfectly with the horizon because your camera didn't move. Track shots, though, they're going to require more post-processing adjustments near the sky and land interface because of that movement over the landscape. So as far as panel shooting gear, you know, I definitely recommend that L bracket for your camera, a sturdy tripod and ball head, a remote cord or intervalometer, a leveling base can make your job a lot easier, and possibly a nodal rail if you're going to be shooting a really close foreground subject and you don't want parallax there occurring. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But before we go any further, I want to play this little video clip from a presentation I did at the recent Nightscaper conference, talking about this really cool all-in-one solution. But there is an all-in-one solution that I'm going to show you today. And this is called the Photo Pro Eagle Series. And you know, I've used lots of tripods over the course of my career from all the main brands. And Photo Pro has been my favorite because I shoot in a lot of extreme conditions. You know, I'll be up in the Arctic when it's 30 to 40 degrees below zero. And a lot of the other tripods I use, the legs get so stiff and gummy, I can hardly get them to work. But Photo Pro has been so smooth and so fluid. I just love their products. And let me show you this really cool ball head that they make on their Eagle series. Sorry, I should correct myself. This is not a ball head. It can be used for many things. It can be used as a panoramic head. It can be used as just a regular landscape head, or it can be used for a gimbal or a fluid head if you're doing video. But the tripod itself actually has a leveling base built right into it. So I don't have to have an extra piece of hardware adding extra weight and heft to my equipment. So all I have to do is level the head like this, lock it down. Then I choose my forward or backward tilt right here, and there's actually degrees here that tell me how many degrees of tilt I have. I just adjust that accordingly. So let's say I'm going to have a little bit of downward tilt. And then I can simply take my rotation, and it maintains the exact same degree of tilt, and every shot is perfectly level to the horizon. That saves me a ton of time when I'm shooting from left to right across my image. This thing is also ratchets by angle. So I can tell exactly how many angle degrees I'm going with each pass that I'm shooting. But I can also take off that angle ratchet and make it a very fluid and smooth thing. Here's the really cool thing about this. If I need to adjust for the nodal point of my lens, I simply move this back, and now I can rotate my pano over the nodal point of my lens. And now I'm going to get rid of that parallax error that I would otherwise have. This is also the only head that would allow me to shoot like straight up, like that, with ease. You know, when I'm out shooting northern lights, sometimes you get that coronal burst straight overhead. With a traditional ball head, it's so hard to kind of get it down in that notch and try to get it down there. I'm adjusting legs of the tripod and so forth. I don't have to worry about that with this head. Or if I'm out here in the desert and I want to shoot mud cracks, well, then it's really easy for me to just move this guy forward, and then I can, let me move that down like that. And now I can shoot straight down, right on the mud cracks. And you can see here, it doesn't even compromise the stability of my tripod. There's no other head on the market that does that. And so with this kind of a head, it's so multi-purpose. I shoot lots of wildlife, I shoot everything. And so I want a head that does a lot of different things for me. And this one fits the bill. All right. But there is an all-in-one solution that I'm going to show you today. Okay, guys, so that kind of gave you just a little introduction, to that Photo Pro Eagle series. And like I said, the leveling base, it's built right into the tripod. You don't have to have extra weight and heft on there for it. It functions as a gimbal for like wildlife and video, a fluid head, and a pano head with minimal weight. It's actually lighter than a ball head. And you can effortlessly shoot your pano frames level to the horizon while maintaining the same degree of forward and backward tilt. And you have the angle ratcheting by degrees for precise rotations. And then you can rotate the lens over the nodal point to eliminate that parallax error. And of course, it's the only head that allows you to shoot straight up and straight down. And so, if you use my individual coupon code Swindler15, you can save 15% on their products. And there's that QR code there. Just scan that and it'll take you right to the website where you can read more about the specs and pick the one that's going to be right for you, depending on how heavy you want it and how sturdy you want it. So very great product, for really improving the speed of your speed and precision of your panoramic shooting.
Awesome.
So any questions, Rafael, on that?
We have a few questions. Let me check. Patrick Campbell, have you tried? Oh, this one is already answered. DX, why? What do you use? What do you use the first safety pass of sky shots?
So what do I use for what?
The safety pass of sky shots. Do you use them afterwards, or?
Sometimes I do. Yeah. Let's say I got greedy on my stacking and now it doesn't stitch together because I took too many shots or something. Then I'll just use the safety set that I took and do it as a level 2.
Nice. Angel Gerardo, when you take the panorama in the blue hour, you don't move the tripod until the Milky Way comes out?
No, I'm fine moving the tripod. I don't like to leave my camera sitting out there exposed because, you never know when a gust of wind might come and knock things over or wreak havoc, or you're sleeping and someone comes and steals your gear. You never know what could happen. And so, like I showed you, you don't have to be in exactly the same spot. When you're combining these later in post, you just readjust based on the horizon line of one versus the other.
Cool. Now we have David Lynch. Does number of stacked images depend on the ISO selected?
It can, but of course, what you're really limited on is registration error from left to right side of your panoramic. And not having that stitch is the worst thing that can happen. And so, yeah, if I'm not shooting a pano and I'm shooting higher ISO, yeah, I'll take more shots to stitch together than if I was shooting a little bit lower ISO. But I just don't have that degree of freedom when I'm shooting a pano.
Okay, Terry Hickey. Would vertical or horizontal shots be better for wall art?
It doesn't really matter. They both work really well. I would say interior designers, they're oftentimes looking for a lot of skinny vertical shots. So Vertoramas, can be great, if you're into the art selling and kind of gets you into a niche that not a lot of photographers are in.
Thank you. Now we have Vince Sidero. Have you ever used a panning device like a mechanical rotator in combination with a tracker to do long exposure pano imaging?
I have not, but it certainly would be possible.
Okay. Paul King, weight capacity of the Eagle setup. And total weight. Do you know the weight capacity of the Eagle setup and its total weight?
Yeah, if you go and go to that QR code there, they have a nice table that compares all the different models. It tells what the load capacity is and the weight of each. I think that E6L, which is a nice tall one with that E6H gimbal, I think it's just under 5 pounds total for tripod and gimbal.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. And so now just to finish up, we'll just go over stitching software. So Lightroom, it's easy to use and fast, but sometimes it's not the most robust processing engine, and it may fail on more difficult stitches. And it can be more prone to stitching errors and abnormalities. Photoshop, it has a more robust stitching engine, and it takes more time, but it's also more accurate. So panels that fail to stitch well in Lightroom may work in Photoshop. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of third-party softwares that some people like to use: PTGUI, Huggin, AutoStitch, GigaPan Stitch, etc. Personally, I don't use them because I just try to take stuff that I know is going to stitch well, and Photoshop has been able to do any of the most difficult ones for me. Parallax error. So the parallax is basically the apparent shift in position of an object when viewed from various angles. And you can easily see how that works. If you just hold your thumb out in front of you and close one eye and then turn your head from left to right, you can see how that thumb, the position of your thumb, shifts relative to the background. And if the camera is rotated around the nodal point or optical center of the lens, then you can really eliminate a lot of that parallax error. And in that case, you're going to need some kind of nodal rail or a slider, or like I was showing you with that Eagle series gimbal head, that's going to be required. And so, if you look here at this camera, you have your sensor in the back. The nodal point is somewhere forward in the forward part of the lens. And so if you have like a nodal rail or slider, you can move that camera back so that way you're rotating over the optical center of the lens. And another note is that today's software does a great job accounting for parallax error. But if you're shooting something real close in your foreground, it can't always eliminate it. And then with wide angle lenses, we do have considerable difference between the different projection types that you have when you're stitching your panos. And so one thing to note is that the perspective projection is often going to fail when you're using a wide angle focal length. So the spherical projection, it's longer in the horizontal axis, and it's going to have more true to life sizing. Cylindrical, it augments the vertical axis for more structure and height, and it can make the Milky Way look much more arched and stretched. And you want to choose the perspective as per your artistic vision. And there's also a huge difference between spherical and cylindrical when combining shots taken with the camera mounted vertically versus the camera mounted horizontally. So, here's that example. This is a spherical projection at 15 millimeter. That looks pretty true to life. But if I try to do it as a cylindrical projection, now it starts to look pretty wonky. And that's generally what you're going to expect to see if you're trying to do cylindrical projections, with vertically mounted shots with a wide angle lens. So in summary, I covered pano shooting techniques. We talked about how to plan your shoot, went over a few foreground enhancement techniques, talked about stacking and tracking, and ended with some gear and software suggestions. And so, I just want to finish up, see if there's any last questions. I invite you to check us out at actionphototours.com. Would love to see you on an upcoming tour or workshop. So Raphael, I'll turn that over to you to see if there's any last questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions. We have a question from Brian Harris. Can the gimbal be used on a monopod?
I guess you could, but it wouldn't have the built-in leveling base, and of course you wouldn't have the stability, to be really precise with anything on a monopod. But yeah, it just screws in just like any normal ball head does to that 1/4-inch screw base.
Awesome. And then, and this is the last question for now, Dana Snyder. How do you indicate the beginning and the ending of a series to help when choosing the raw files?
So I just keep a Hi, Dana, by the way. I just keep a consistent workflow when I do that. So I know I always shoot from left to right. And if I do need to, like separate, one section from another, what I'll do is I'll just take like a really short exposure, like half a second at night, which would be like a black frame. And so for me, that gives separation between one group to the next. There's a little brighter out. I might put my hand in front of a shot just to say, here's a separator.
Fantastic, fantastic. And the last one, Dave Lynch. What camera do you use? Is
Well, I shoot Sony now, so I have an A7R3 and an A7R4. And if I keep saving my pennies, I might hopefully get my dream camera, Sony Alpha 1.
Okay, I think we have one last question here by Robert Pirenfeldner. How much time does the workflow for post-processing take you normally?
Oh, it just really depends. Some shots are quick and easy. I can be out in under 30 minutes. Other shots may take an hour or two just to work out the blending and the selections and everything like that. Some selections are easy. Some selections are very, very tedious and difficult.
Awesome, David. I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us again. Any final words before we say goodbye to everyone?
Just thanks again for tuning in, everyone. And it was a pleasure and happy night shooting.
Awesome. Now I see that Sandra sent me another question by Guido Tramontano. Any tip to quickly find a nodal point for different focal lengths? And that's going to be the last one.
No, the only real way is to go look it up in a nodal point table. What I find is you never need to really be that precise. As long as you're in the ballpark, then it's going to work far better than if you're shooting with the camera rotated around the sensor.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for this amazing class, super detailed class. It's been so fun. And well, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you like this video, as always, give us a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next Wednesday in another video. And remember that you have the power to imagine, plan, and shoot legendary photos. Bye-bye. Thank you, David. Thank you, and I'll see you around the world. Bye.